Tonight we slip through the velvet curtains of time, into a world where travel smells faintly of coal smoke and ambition. The year is somewhere in the late 1800s. You stand upon a creaking wooden platform, clutching a ticket that feels more like a passport to another class entirely. The air hums with the hiss of steam, and the shrill whistle cuts through the chatter of porters shouting for trunks heavier than your rent. You've come to ride the marvel of the age, the railway, but you probably won't survive this if you forget your manners. Because in the 19th century, decorum was oxygen, and one public sneeze could socially assassinate you faster than typhoid ever could. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You clutch your parasol, or perhaps your bowler hat, as you step toward the waiting carriages. There's a faint vibration under your boots, as if the earth itself is bracing for movement. The steam engine looms ahead, black and gleaming, huffing like a dragon freshly annoyed from slumber. You can practically feel its pride. It's not just metal, it's civilization on wheels. But as magnificent as it looks, boarding it is an obstacle course of etiquette. In this peculiar century, travel was performance. You don't simply get on a train, you enter, with poise calibrated to your social rank. For women, there was an entire choreography. Step up with your left foot first, never expose the ankle, and for heaven's sake, avoid stepping on the hem of your dress. Men had their own rules. Offer an arm if a lady hesitates, but never presume she needs one. Historians still argue whether the practice of men averting their gaze during a lady's ascent was genuine modesty or just a collective panic about glimpsing forbidden lace. The carriages themselves tell you immediately where you stand in life. First-class cars gleam with polished mahogany, deep green velvet, and brass fixtures that seem designed to blind the unworthy. Second class is clean but humble, still respectable, provided you keep your shoes polished. And third class, well, you can smell it before you see it. Wooden benches, straw scattered on the floor, and passengers clinging to dignity as tightly as to their parcels. One mainstream historical fact stands out. By the 1860s, railway travel in Britain was so widespread that nearly every village could hear the whistle of progress. The world was shrinking. But even as distances collapsed, the social gaps expanded within the carriages. Each class was a microcosm of Victorian society. No one crossed invisible lines unless they fancied a public lecture from a stranger. You settle in, gingerly, because the seats aren't forgiving. The train lurches forward, and instantly, the atmosphere transforms. Conversation lowers, skirts rustle, newspapers unfold like protective shields. You're meant to behave as though the train isn't moving at all, as though your serenity alone keeps it gliding smoothly across the countryside. A proper traveler never fidgets. They stare out the window with a polite, meditative melancholy, as if personally contemplating the nature of industrial progress. Then comes the sound, an odd symphony of clattering wheels, creaking wood, and rhythmic puffing that settles into something hypnotic. If you were hoping for silence, you're in the wrong century. You'll soon discover that Victorians treated noise differently. The occasional sneeze or cough was permissible, provided you muffled it in lace. But a laugh, especially from a woman, was practically an act of rebellion. And yet, beneath all this polished composure, people were thrilled. This was speed. For most, it was the first time their bodies moved faster than a galloping horse. Some travelers gripped their seats, convinced that velocity might rearrange their internal organs. There's even a fringe tidbit about early passengers believing the brain could liquefy if one traveled too quickly, a notion that thankfully dissolved around the same time as their lunch sandwiches. You peer out at the passing fields, a blur of green stitched with fences and smoke. Farmers pause to wave, children cheer. You smile, caught in that fleeting sense that the world is shifting around you, that time itself might be compressing into iron rails. Yet even as the landscape flies by, you can't escape the rigid choreography within. There's an unspoken rule: do not engage too soon. A few moments of polite silence must pass before conversation, as though your fellow travelers need to forget that they're all trapped together in a metal box. You glance across the carriage. A gentleman in a stovepipe hat folds his paper, pretending not to notice the small child staring at his pocket watch. A woman adjusts her bonnet, stealing a look out the window to avoid eye contact. You realize something rather amusing: everyone is performing solitude together. It's almost comical, this shared isolation. You stifle a chuckle, and immediately, two sets of eyes turn your way. Victorian trains weren't just about travel, they were stages for respectability. The great irony, of course, is that beneath all that restraint, scandal brewed like tea left too long to steep. Etiquette wasn't just about politeness, it was a protective shell for all the anxieties modernity had unleashed. The train connected classes, genders, and strangers in ways society hadn't planned for, and so the rules tightened like corsets. You could share a carriage with a duke, or a con artist. Either way, you'd better mind your posture. By now, your gloves are smudged from the soot sneaking in through the window cracks, and your throat tastes faintly of iron. You glance down the corridor. Well, in most trains, there isn't one yet. Early carriages were isolated compartments. Once you were in, you stayed with the same people until your destination. Imagine the tension when someone accidentally offended another passenger within the first 10 minutes. There was no escape except through the window, and that was frowned upon, mostly because it risked hat loss. As you settle back, you feel the gentle sway of the carriage and the rhythm of the rails. You realize you're not just traveling, you're performing a quiet ritual. The train, for all its noise and grime, demands civility. It's a moving mirror reflecting how Victorians wanted to see themselves: dignified, orderly, and slightly superior to the chaos of the world outside. And yet, even here, with every puff of steam and every meticulously crossed leg, the cracks begin to show. Because no matter how polished the etiquette, humanity, curious, fidgeting, and occasionally impolite, always leaks through. The train whistles again, and the countryside rolls on. You lean your head against the window, the glass warm from the sun, and feel yourself slipping deeper into this strange, soot-scented civilization, half progress, half pantomime. The platform fades behind you, swallowed by smoke and distance, and now you're committed, hurtling forward into the delicate theater of the 19th century railway carriage. The real performance begins not when the train departs, but the moment you enter. That, dear traveler, is where reputations were made or quietly destroyed. Victorian manuals on manners, those brick-sized tomes of social survival, dedicated entire chapters to how to board a train. Not why, mind you. The why was self-evident, since trains had become the arteries of empire. But how? That was the difference between refinement and ridicule. You're told to wait your turn, of course, but turn is a slippery concept when 20 people are pretending not to shove each other. You clutch your ticket, posture perfect, pretending that the swirling soot isn't working its way into your eyelashes. The door swings open, and here it is, the carriage, your social arena for the next few hours. The first rule? Never rush. To hurry is vulgar. The second? Never turn your back toward the seated passengers as you step in, for that would display, well, more than politeness permits. Historians still argue whether this rule originated from modesty or from an unspoken competition of grace, a slow-motion ballet of fabric and restraint. Either way, you enter as if crossing a ballroom, not a threshold. If you're a lady, this maneuver is triply complex. You must manage your skirt, your reticule, your hat, and possibly your nerves, all while pretending it's effortless. For gentlemen, the challenge lies in offering assistance without presumption. Extend your hand only if the lady seems in danger of tripping. Offer a smile only if it won't be mistaken for flirtation. In short, it's a social minefield disguised as chivalry. A mainstream historical fact slides in here like an observation from a passing station. By the 1870s, rail travel had grown so popular that even etiquette guides had to issue specific addenda. Cassell's Household Guide, for instance, urged travelers to remember that a railway carriage is a public room, and thus one's conduct should be as if in polite company. Which sounds charming until you realize polite company meant sitting rigidly upright for 6 hours and pretending not to sweat. You test this theory as you step into the compartment. The seats are upholstered in deep velvet, lovely, but merciless to anyone with dust on their hem. A woman beside the window clutches her lace handkerchief as if it might protect her from social contagion. A man with an impressive mustache looks up from his newspaper, measuring your worth in milliseconds. The pressure is absurd. You can't help thinking that modern commuters, with their coffee cups and earbuds, have it easy. No one today has to fear being silently judged for the angle of their elbows. Your gloved hand finds the polished brass handle of the door, and, click, it shuts behind you. There's no going back. You take a seat, remembering to lower yourself gently, as any sudden motion could ripple through the carriage like gossip through a parlor. Across from you, a young woman with an ostrich feather in her hat nods almost imperceptibly, an acknowledgement that you've passed the unspoken test of entry. You exhale, careful not to make it sound relieved. A gentleman opposite clears his throat, a signal that he intends to open conversation, but not yet. There is a timing to everything, and early enthusiasm is frowned upon. What happens next is perhaps the oddest custom of all, the silent observation period. For the first few minutes of any journey, passengers study one another in polite quiet, gauging whether conversation is possible or dangerous. Victorians treated small talk as a scientific experiment, one where the slightest misstep could explode into scandal. One fringe tidbit claims that an entire family feud once began because a stranger misidentified another's breed of lapdog during such a journey. The train, it seems, carried both people and potential social disasters at remarkable speed. The engine jolts, and the compartment shudders. A puff of coal smoke sneaks through the open vent, blending with the scent of leather and starch. You resist the urge to cough. Etiquette manuals warned against indelicate exhalations. Instead, you deploy the genteel half cough, that stifled, throat-clearing sound used by those wishing to remain visible yet blameless. The train gathers speed, and through the window, the world begins to blur. Fields, cottages, and telegraph poles rush by, turning the landscape into streaks of motion. But inside the carriage, time slows. The etiquette of movement gives way to the etiquette of stillness. You notice that every gesture matters. How you cross your legs, carefully, at the ankles, how you fold your hands, in your lap, never on your knees, even how you look out the window, with mild interest, not existential dread. It's like inhabiting a museum exhibit of composure. And though you might smirk at the absurdity, there's something strangely calming about the precision of it all. The woman with the ostrich feather adjusts her veil, catching your eye for the briefest second. It's a risk. Eye contact on a train could be the social equivalent of shouting across a ballroom. But she looks away quickly, pretending to be fascinated by a cow in a distant field. You, likewise, pretend to study the same cow, though you can't even tell if it's real or a trick of speed. There's a sense that everyone is aware of everyone else's breathing. The confined air makes it intimate, yet the rules make it distant. Historians still debate whether this tension fostered a peculiar kind of loneliness, a collective isolation unique to the industrial age. You are close enough to hear another person's heartbeat, yet bound by etiquette not to acknowledge they exist. Then, as if the universe feels the need for comic relief, the gentleman's hat tumbles from the luggage rack, landing squarely in the lap of the woman with the feather. Time freezes. Every eye widens, even the train seems to hold its breath. The man stammers, she blushes, and you, good traveler that you are, pretend not to notice while silently thanking fate for the entertainment. The incident resolves with awkward laughter, a small ripple through the otherwise still pond. Just like that, the atmosphere lightens. Someone even mentions the weather, that universal refuge of polite society. You realize the train's rhythm has become your lullaby, the steady pulse beneath all the pretense. As the sun dips low and the lamps flicker on, you catch your reflection in the window, half you, half ghost of steam. You look composed, but there's soot at your collar and a smudge on your glove. Perfection is impossible on the rails, yet everyone keeps pretending otherwise. That might be the quiet secret of Victorian etiquette. It wasn't about being pure. It was about performing control while the world roared past outside. The whistle blows again, echoing down the line like a sigh. The train doesn't slow. It only reminds you that forward is the only direction. And so, with a gentle lurch and 1,000 unspoken rules, you continue your strange, elegant journey through the age of manners and steam. You're beginning to get the hang of it now, the way to hold yourself, the silent ballet of glances and half smiles. But soon you'll discover that where you sit, and how you sit, matters as much as anything you say or wear. The railway carriage may appear to be a simple box on wheels, but in truth it's a miniature kingdom of hierarchy, and every inch of plush upholstery tells a story of status. The seat you occupy is your social calling card. The further you are from the door, the higher your prestige. In first class, you're cushioned by thick velvet and the faint scent of polish and privilege. The mahogany panels gleam with the obsessive care of people who believe order itself keeps the empire from collapsing. A brass oil lamp swings gently overhead, offering a soft glow that flatters every glove and cufflink. But shift 2 compartments down, and the illusion begins to crack. Second class offers sturdy comfort without luxury, good enough for merchants, governesses, and anyone who reads the Times but not the Illustrated London News. The floorboards creak, and the cushions feel like they've been disciplined into thinness. It's here that politeness is practical, not ornamental. You might nod to a stranger, even exchange a few cautious words about politics, provided everyone agrees to disagree. And then there's third class. Third class, where civilization becomes a suggestion rather than a standard. The benches are bare wood, sometimes covered in straw to soften the bumps. The windows rattle, the air smells of smoke and sweat, and yet, despite all that, there's laughter. Workers, soldiers, and washerwomen chatter openly, blissfully unconcerned with the delicate performance unfolding in the upper compartments. Historians still argue whether this open cheer was resilience or rebellion, but either way, it had no place among the silk-hatted elite who pretended trains were merely salons in motion. One mainstream historical fact stands firm here. Until the Railway Regulation Act of 1844, third-class passengers weren't even guaranteed shelter from the elements. Some rode in open wagons, rain or shine, as though humanity itself was being tested by weather. After the act, railway companies were compelled to provide covered cars for all, but etiquette, of course, was still optional. You, meanwhile, are in second class, close enough to glimpse the gilt edges of privilege, but not so near that you must pretend to enjoy foie gras in a moving vehicle. From your vantage, you can observe both extremes, the rigid dignity of the upper crust and the cheerful resilience of the lower. It's a sociological buffet, and you're seated right in the middle of it. A conductor strolls past, tipping his cap to a first-class gentleman and barely glancing at you. His uniform gleams, buttons shining like tiny suns. You realize he's not just checking tickets, is maintaining the sacred social order. The mere act of inspection is ritual, affirming that everyone knows their place. The lady opposite you adjusts her gloves. "Ghastly business," she mutters, "how they let anyone travel these days." You nod politely, though you're not sure if she means anyone in general or you specifically. It's the kind of vague insult wrapped in velvet that Victorians mastered. You take refuge in your view out the window. The countryside rolls past, hedgerows, sheep, and the occasional smoking chimney announcing industrial progress. Yet the world inside the carriage feels almost static, bound by invisible walls of propriety. You think of modern trains, where people lean against doors, scrolling through glowing screens. Here, even the angle of your hat brim is a form of communication. A fringe tidbit drifts into your thoughts. In some trains, particularly on the continent, there existed ladies-only compartments. They were designed to protect female travelers from the unwelcome gazes or advances of men. British society flirted with the idea but mostly decided that proper behavior, not segregation, would keep everyone respectable. Historians still debate whether that confidence was chivalrous or simply naive. You shift slightly in your seat, a mistake. The gentleman beside you looks over, perhaps judging whether your movement suggests restlessness or discomfort. It's absurd, but the scrutiny is real. Victorian travelers were taught that composure equaled morality. A restless passenger hinted at inner turmoil, possibly even moral weakness. Heaven forbid your leg fall asleep. Still, not every rule is grim. There's a faint charm in this structured absurdity. You find yourself smiling at the theatricality of it, the unspoken agreement that even inside a rumbling, smoke-filled box, everyone must behave as though at afternoon tea. You can almost hear the echo of etiquette manuals whispering, "A lady may endure inconvenience, but she must never show it." Then, unexpectedly, the train jolts over a rough patch of track. Luggage clatters. Someone gasps. For a moment, decorum evaporates, an audible "oh" ripples through the compartment, followed by the quick resumption of polite stillness. The recovery is seamless, like a stage troupe pretending the curtain never fell. You admire the commitment. You notice the difference in sound between the classes too. From first class, silence reigns, hushed conversation and the soft rustle of silk. From third, distant laughter and song leak through the thin wooden partitions. It's oddly comforting, that hint of life from beyond the velvet barrier. The train is a single organism, each compartment a different heartbeat. A portly man across from you clears his throat and announces, "Ghastly thing, progress. Too fast by half." Everyone murmurs agreement, though none seem willing to abandon the miracle of movement they are literally sitting in. That's the paradox of the age. Progress admired, feared, and relentlessly discussed between mouthfuls of polite sandwiches. The whistle blows again, and the compartment dips into shadow as the train enters a tunnel. Darkness swallows every face, and suddenly, every rule of decorum feels fragile. The air thickens with unspoken thought. No one can see your expression. The woman beside you grips her reticule a little tighter. A cough echoes from the far end, followed by nervous laughter when daylight returns. It's oddly intimate, this shared vulnerability, and you sense why etiquette mattered so fiercely. It wasn't just vanity, it was armor. With strangers pressed shoulder to shoulder, anonymity could feel dangerous. Manners kept chaos at bay. They told everyone where to look, what to say, and, crucially, what not to feel. As the light floods back, the moment passes. The woman with the feathered hat catches your eye again and smiles faintly. Almost human now, stripped of artifice by darkness. Then she looks away, resuming her porcelain composure. You do the same, settling back into the steady rhythm of civility. The train chugs on, slicing through the green countryside, and the compartments remain their neat little worlds. The rich pretending not to notice the poor laughing anyway, and you, balanced between them, watching how etiquette turns iron and smoke into something curiously beautiful. The carriage rocks gently, and with it, the dance of glances begins again. You start to notice that in this peculiar world, looking is both an art and a crime. Victorians were obsessed with propriety. How the eyes behaved said more about one's character than any conversation ever could. It's not that you couldn't look at your fellow passengers, it's that you had to look properly. Your gaze should drift, light, passing, appreciative but never lingering. A long stare was tantamount to social trespass. A smile at the wrong moment could ignite gossip hotter than the locomotive's furnace. Historians still argue whether this strict visual etiquette stemmed from modesty or sheer paranoia about moral decay. Either way, it left everyone on edge, blinking in choreographed politeness. You catch your reflection in the window, the countryside flickering behind it. You practice the train look, neutral, serene, slightly curious. The trick, etiquette manuals claimed, was to seem as though you were contemplating the landscape, never the people. Because heaven forbid you be caught observing the fascinating human zoo 3 feet away. Across from you, a gentleman with an extravagantly curled mustache folds his newspaper and glances up. The paper itself, the Morning Chronicle, serves as a social shield, a sort of early privacy screen. People hide behind it not from boredom but from intimacy. You notice the subtlety of it. Fold once if you're open to small talk, twice if you're done with the world. He's folded it twice. The man is practically invisible. Next to him, a young woman feigns interest in the scenery. Her gloved hand rests lightly on her lap, but her eyes dart occasionally toward the reflection in the glass, the safest way to observe without technically looking. You realize that everyone here is performing a slow-motion game of avoidance, a collective act of refined paranoia. It's funny, really. In a world that prided itself on restraint, trains force strangers into an intimacy no parlor could match. You can smell each other's perfume, hear each sigh, even feel the warmth radiating from nearby shoulders. And yet, you must pretend it isn't happening. That's the paradox of Victorian travel, closeness without connection. A mainstream historical fact adds weight to the scene. By the 1880s, the British rail system was one of the most extensive in the world, carrying over 500 million passengers annually. Imagine that, millions of people sharing confined spaces, all pretending not to notice one another. Sociologists later dubbed it the birth of public anonymity, a polite invisibility that still echoes in the modern subway stare. But back in your compartment, invisibility is an act of will. You glance down at your gloves, smoothing the fabric just to give your eyes something to do. The gesture feels oddly calming, a small rebellion against the stifling stillness. You remember reading somewhere that certain railway companies issued printed etiquette guides reminding passengers to avoid undue curiosity. The subtext was clear. Eyes can wander, but only along the tracks outside. Still, temptation lurks. Humans are naturally nosy, and Victorians, despite their buttoned-up image, were no exception. You catch a snippet of conversation from the next compartment, a laugh too loud to be polite. The mustached gentleman's eyes flicker, his entire demeanor vibrating with disapproval. You wonder what he'd make of today's commuters, shouting into phones about lunch orders. And yet, even he betrays curiosity. He lowers his paper just slightly, enough to glimpse the source of the laughter. His stern facade cracks for a moment. You can almost hear the internal voice. Well, one must know what one is condemning. There's a delightful fringe tidbit about this kind of hypocrisy. Travelers were so wary of being seen as too observant that some resorted to elaborate subterfuge. Mirrors disguised as pocket watches, fans with reflective panels, tiny spy gadgets for genteel curiosity. They could glance without guilt, gossip without getting caught. Some even claimed to be people watching for moral instruction, as if judging strangers were a public service. Outside, the train curves along a river, the sun flashing on the water like spilled coins. The light bounces through the window, and for a moment, the compartment feels less like a cage and more like a painting. The woman opposite you meets your eyes briefly in the reflection, just long enough to acknowledge your shared humanity. Then, instantly, both of you retreat behind the safety of composure. It's strange, this polite denial of presence. It makes the few genuine interactions feel electric. You recall how earlier, in the tunnel's brief darkness, everyone seemed momentarily honest. Now the daylight returns, and with it, the masks. You begin to appreciate how exhausting politeness can be when it's constant performance. You shift your gaze to the brass luggage rack above. Trunks are stacked neatly, labeled with looping handwriting, Miss E. Forrester, Colonel H. Whitby, L.K. Smythe. Even the handwriting announces class and confidence. Somewhere beneath all this order, a stray umbrella thumps against the roof. No one acknowledges it. To do so would be to break the fragile spell of indifference. Historians still debate whether these strict visual codes made Victorians repressed or simply resourceful. Some argue that learning how not to look sharpened their perception in other ways, through tone, gesture, silence. Others insist it only made them lonelier. You, sitting here with your reflection and your thoughts, suspect both are true. The train rattles through another small station, figures waving on the platform, the brief blur of faces gone before you can register them. You realize that, ironically, those fleeting glimpses feel more genuine than the studied stillness inside. Out there, people move naturally, unconcerned with etiquette. In here, every breath is measured. You test a small experiment. You turn slightly toward the window, letting your reflection line up with the woman's opposite you. You hold her gaze in the glass for just a heartbeat longer than is proper. Her eyes widen, not in offense, but in recognition. Then, just as swiftly, she lowers her veil, signaling the end of that silent rebellion. It's exhilarating and faintly ridiculous, two strangers floating through etiquette violations. You return your focus to the landscape, pretending to study the hedgerows again. It occurs to you that these social rules were both constraint and comfort. In a society obsessed with moral order, the train forced people to coexist without chaos. Every lowered gaze, every half nod, was a kind of truce. You may not speak, but you agree to endure each other's company in peace. The mustached gentleman finally clears his throat, a sound both commanding and weary. Too much staring from the lower classes these days, he mutters, without irony. You nod sympathetically, though part of you suspects he's referring to himself in that mirror a few minutes ago. The whistle blows again, announcing another town. The train slows, passengers rustle, and new faces prepare to board. You take one last glance at your reflection, half real, half vapor, and remind yourself that in this century, seeing and being seen were never simple acts. They were negotiations, little social contracts made of glances and grace. Outside, the countryside shifts again, but inside, the rules remain unbroken, except for that one shared, forbidden glance that lingers in your mind, like the echo of a secret you'll never speak aloud. The next hour settles into a rhythm, the clack of wheels, the hiss of steam, and the subtle chorus of people pretending not to exist. It's soothing, until the air begins to thicken. You wrinkle your nose, the atmosphere has shifted. A faint metallic tang drifts in from the vents, chased by the unmistakable scent of coal smoke. You've entered the next great trial of 19th century train travel, surviving the smells. The Victorians adored progress, but they were never quite ready for its aroma. Coal-fired locomotives belched out soot like black snow, filling the sky, and occasionally, your lungs. It clung to everything: hair, hats, lace, lungs. You could step on board as a vision of crisp linen and step off looking like a chimney sweep with ambition. One mainstream historical fact drives it home. By the 1870s, the average long-distance train passenger in Britain inhaled roughly half an ounce of coal dust per journey. It was the price of speed, and of fashion slowly surrendering to physics. You tug your collar slightly, feeling the grit gathering there. Etiquette manuals never covered this. There's no polite way to cough up soot. Instead, you employ the genteel alternative: a small, muffled cough behind a handkerchief embroidered with your initials. Everyone knows what's happening, everyone pretends they don't. Then there's the human bouquet. Picture dozens of travelers laid in wool, corsets, and nervous perspiration, sealed in a heated box. Perfume and pomade try valiantly to mask reality. A gentleman's cologne might mingle with the scent of cigar smoke and mutton sandwiches. The result? A fragrance only the industrial age could love. You try opening the small upper window pane for relief. A gust of cold air whips through, scattering the feathers of your seatmate's hat. She gasps softly, clutching her veil like a shield. You apologize. Well, you half apologize, because honestly, fresh air feels like salvation. The man opposite you frowns. His mustache trembles with indignation. Drafts cause cholera, he declares with authority. Historians still argue whether Victorians truly believed this or simply used it as an excuse to avoid discomfort. Either way, you close the window. Etiquette demands sacrifice. To cope with the miasma, Victorians invented a small army of personal gadgets. You glance around and notice them in action: vinaigrettes, tiny silver cases filled with aromatic vinegar-soaked sponges, scented handkerchiefs discreetly pressed to noses, and even portable odor respirators, curious mesh devices meant to purify the air as you breathed. A fringe tidbit notes that one Parisian inventor marketed a railway nose shield lined with rose oil, essentially an oil-scented face mask for genteel travelers. You can imagine the muffled conversation that followed. "Pardon me, madam, your lavender is rather loud today." Despite these defenses, the smells persist. The compartment becomes its own strange ecosystem, where class, chemistry, and courage mix in equal measure. The upper-class travelers deploy perfumes that smell faintly of violets and power. The middle classes rely on soap and stoicism. The third class, well, they rely on open windows and a sense of humor. You're caught somewhere between, breathing carefully, praying your dignity lasts longer than your patience. The scent of food joins the fray. Someone unwraps a parcel of roast chicken, cold, greasy, and aromatic. The odor seeps through the carriage like a ghost of Sunday lunch. The woman with the feathered hat stiffens, her eyes glisten with restrained judgment. Eating in public, especially in confined spaces, was considered borderline scandalous. But hunger makes revolutionaries of us all. You pretend not to notice as your stomach growls in sympathy. Outside, the wind carries smoke trails over the landscape, blurring the horizon. Inside, you feel coated. Your skin, your clothes, even your thoughts seem dusted in coal. You realize that the glamour of rail travel existed mostly in paintings and postcards. The reality was a battle against soot and sweat, waged with lace and lemon water. Still, there's something heroic about it all. The Victorians faced discomfort with the same determination they applied to empire building. You imagine them writing letters afterward. The journey was delightful, though the air was somewhat vigorous. Translation: I nearly asphyxiated, but one mustn't complain. The mustached gentleman across from you removes his hat to wipe his brow, revealing an unexpected bald patch. The lady beside him blinks twice, quickly looking away. Her fan flutters, a delicate semaphore of alarm. You smile to yourself. Even perspiration must follow protocol here. It's almost endearing how etiquette turns suffering into spectacle. A curious sound interrupts your thoughts, the hiss of the steam vent just outside. The noise fills the carriage like a mechanical sigh. You glance out to see the engine exhaling clouds that twist into the sunset. It's beautiful and filthy all at once. Modernity's perfume, you think, pungent and inescapable. Historians still debate whether the constant exposure to soot had any social implications beyond laundry bills. Some suggest it democratized date. Everyone, from duchess to dock worker, arrived equally smudged. Others claim the wealthy simply traveled with maids who brushed them clean at every stop. Either way, the grime was the great equalizer, whispering that even the most polished veneer could not outshine coal dust. As evening deepens, lamps flicker to life, fueled by oil that adds yet another layer to the olfactory chaos. The smell of kerosene mingles with tobacco and damp wool. You wonder how anyone managed romance in such conditions, but apparently, they did. Perhaps olfactory numbness helped. You reach for your own small bottle of cologne, dabbing it on your wrist. The scent, citrus and something faintly medicinal, cuts through the haze for a brief, blessed moment. The woman opposite notices, her eyes softening with gratitude. "Lemon," she whispers. You nod, offering a faint smile. Shared survival builds strange alliances. The train sways, the lamps hum, and the air feels heavy but almost comforting now. You've adapted. Maybe that's what Victorians were best at, adapting with style. When faced with filth, they invented perfume. When surrounded by strangers, they invented etiquette. The soot settles, and so does your spirit. You lean back, letting your head rest against the seat, feeling the steady pulse of the locomotive beneath you. The smell of progress, smoke, sweat, perfume, and steel, wraps around you like a blanket. Somewhere between disgust and nostalgia, you realize, this is what civilization smells like when it's still under construction. The whistle blows again, long and low, a melancholy note that drifts through the dusk. You close your eyes, breathing in despite yourself. The scent is imperfect, but it's alive, proof that you're moving, that the world is changing, even if you'll need 3 baths to recover. And as the train races on, you smile faintly. Perhaps there's no higher etiquette than endurance, the quiet grace of pretending not to notice what everyone secretly smells. You've survived the soot and the scents, which earns you unofficial veteran status among Victorian travelers. Now you face the next trial, talking. Or rather, not talking. Because aboard a 19th century train, conversation was an art so delicate it could crumble with one misplaced syllable. It begins innocently. Someone coughs, someone else shifts, and then comes that suspended moment when a sentence might be born. You sense it hovering, like a shy bird perched on the edge of social propriety. The question is, who dares to speak first? A mainstream historical fact fits neatly here. Mid-Victorian Britain regarded railway conversation as optional but dangerous. Etiquette books, such as Hints on Railway Travelling, warned that silence is the surest safeguard of dignity. Still, travellers couldn't resist the urge to fill the clattering void. After all, journeys were long, and curiosity longer. The mustached gentleman opposite you seems on the verge of discourse. His lips twitch, his eyes dart to yours, then to the window. At last he murmurs, "Fine evening." You agree, it is fine, though the air tastes faintly of soot and regret. A polite smile seals the contract. Conversation has officially begun. But it must never become too animated. Loud voices suggest vulgar enthusiasm. Laughter, unless faintly apologetic, is social heresy. And subjects? A minefield. Politics divides, religion offends, and weather, blessed weather, is the only safe refuge. So you both settle there, trading mild remarks about clouds as if the fate of the empire depended on barometric pressure. The woman with the feathered hat listens but doesn't join. Proper ladies often feign disinterest until invited twice. You wonder if you should extend the invitation. Then remember, if a man invites a lady to converse too soon, it can be construed as forwardness. Historians still argue whether these conversational rituals were truly protective of women or simply tools to keep them elegantly silent. Either way, your courage evaporates faster than the tea in your flask. Instead, you turn your attention to a new voice. From the far end of the compartment, an elderly matron begins regaling her neighbor with a tale about a cousin who once lost a parasol out the window. Her story wins through so many family connections it feels like a genealogical odyssey. You glance around, every listener is politely trapped. The mustached man coughs into his glove, a genteel SOS. The matron's companion nods dutifully, murmuring indeed at each pause. Victorians perfected this performance of engagement. It wasn't about exchanging ideas, it was about maintaining harmony. Politeness meant never challenging another's story, even if it was wildly implausible. You could hear someone claim to have tea with Queen Victoria herself, and your only response was, "How delightful, Yet beneath this calm surface bubbled mischief. Whisper networks of gossip thrived aboard the rails. Travelers might lower their voices to discuss the scandal of the week, a runaway elopement, a politician's indiscretion, or the shocking price of oysters in London. A fringe tidbit claims that some etiquette tutors encouraged ladies to practice discreet curiosity, meaning they could gather gossip provided they never appeared interested. You imagine the mental gymnastics that required. The train rattles, and conversation ebbs. A moment of companionable silence settles, punctuated only by the steady heartbeat of the wheels. You realize the noise itself fills the gaps between words, making small talk seem unnecessary. Perhaps that's why so many passengers stared dreamily out windows, listening to machinery converse on their behalf. Then, as if the engine senses your thought, it shrieks. The sound jolts everyone, and for a heartbeat, propriety vanishes. Someone gasps, another laughs too loudly. The laughter spreads, a ripple of release. The woman with the feathered hat even lets slip a small giggle, promptly covering her mouth as though she'd confessed to treason. It's strangely endearing, this fear of one's own joy. When the quiet returns, you decide to risk a comment. They say the shrillness depends on the engineer's mood, you offer. The mustached man blinks, surprised by your bravery. Then he chuckles, a dry, dignified sound, and replies, "Then ours must be quite an optimist." It's the closest thing to camaraderie you've shared all day. That's how it happens. Conversation on a train, born out of shared inconvenience. Etiquette manuals could never fully suppress it. Even the sternest traveler eventually succumbed to curiosity. You start to relax, allowing yourself a genuine smile. The woman across from you notices, her expression softening. She leans forward slightly, an invitation. "Do you travel often?" she asks. You answer honestly, perhaps too honestly, describing your fascination with trains and their strange mixture of elegance and grime. She listens, nodding in rhythm with the wheels. There's comfort in the exchange, a human rhythm beneath the mechanical one. For a moment, the carriage feels warmer, less constrained. Still, you tread carefully. Every sentence must be measured, every anecdote modest. Victorians distrusted those who spoke too freely. Loquacity suggested vanity. You recall another guideline from the era. A well-bred person talks little of themselves and nothing of their ailments. Which is a pity, because the soot has given you quite a tickle in your throat. Outside, twilight spreads across the fields. Lamps flicker inside the compartment, tinting faces gold. The world feels intimate, softened by motion. Conversation drifts again, some words about the harvest, a shy complaint about the fair, even a tentative laugh. The etiquette that once restrained you now seems almost tender, like a fragile truce between strangers. Yet not all exchanges end well. In a nearby seat, a young man attempts a bold experiment, complimenting a lady's bonnet. The silence that follows could curdle milk. Compliments, especially unsolicited ones, were socially lethal unless uttered under strict conditions: daylight, witnesses, and complete sincerity. The poor man stammers, the lady turns to stone. You watch the disaster unfold with quiet sympathy. When he retreats into a newspaper, the compartment exhales collectively, crisis averted. Historians still debate whether Victorian etiquette suppressed genuine connection or merely refined it. Some claim these stiff codes made intimacy more precious, like rare porcelain that mustn't crack. Others argue it bred generations of emotional acrobats. Watching the passengers now, you sense both truths. Beneath every polite exchange hums the ache of things left unsaid. You think of modern trains, where strangers chat freely, or not at all, and wonder which world feels lonelier. Here, silence is full of meaning. Today, it's often empty. Maybe the Victorians understood that manners were a way of acknowledging one another, even when words failed. As the train speeds into night, voices fade into murmurs. The woman with the feathered hat nods drowsily, her veil slipping. The mustached gentleman's newspaper droops in his hand. The old matron still talks softly, her story looping endlessly, comforting in its absurdity. You rest your head against the cool window pane, feeling the vibration through your bones. The sound of the rails becomes its own language, steady, sure, endlessly polite. You close your eyes and think, conversation or silence, it's all the same music. What mattered wasn't what Victorians said, but how beautifully they avoided saying it. You wake from a brief doze to the unmistakable sound of paper rustling and something being unwrapped. That can only mean one thing: someone is about to break the sacred peace with an act both necessary and socially perilous: eating on a Victorian train. It begins with a whisper of crinkled wax paper and the faint, traitorous smell of ham. The mustached gentleman opposite you tries to pretend he doesn't notice, but his nose twitches. The woman with the feathered hat lifts her chin, a signal of restrained judgment. You, caught somewhere between empathy and hunger, glance discreetly toward the offender. It's a young man in a traveling cloak, looking as guilty as if he'd just robbed the crown. A mainstream historical fact gives context to his shame. Before the late 1870s, railway dining cars were rare, and passengers had to fend for themselves. They brought hampers packed by servants or purchased from station vendors: cold meats, pickles, bread, fruit, sometimes even small bottles of claret wrapped in newspaper. It all sounds charming until you're trapped in a sealed carriage with the aroma of hard-boiled eggs at close range. Etiquette dictated that eating in public should be discreet, even invisible. Women especially were advised to nibble delicately and without display, as if food were both a sin and a performance art. You imagine the challenge: balancing a chicken leg, lace gloves, and dignity while the train lurches around a curve. Even the most devout practitioner of grace could end up baptizing her neighbor's sleeve in gravy. You remember reading somewhere that Queen Victoria herself refused to eat aboard her private train for years, convinced it was vulgar. Historians still argue whether this royal aversion came from modesty or simple mistrust of railway kitchens. Either way, her influence trickled down. To chew on the move was to risk appearing uncivilized. The young man unwraps another layer: cheese, by the smell of it. It has ambition. You suppress a smile as he sneaks a bite, turning his head toward the window like a criminal seeking concealment. Across from him, the mustached gentleman folds his newspaper pointedly, the universal signal of moral disapproval. The young man wilts slightly. You find yourself torn between sides, the purist of propriety and the brave eater of cheese. A fringe tidbit slips into your mind. In 1883, a London etiquette columnist proposed that railway companies offer aromatic carriages scented with lavender to combat the odorous menace of picnic travelers. Imagine booking a seat not by class, but by smell. You'd fit in perfectly, sandwiched between lemon and roast beef. But hunger, like steam, refuses to be contained. You decide to open your own parcel, a modest offering of biscuits and an apple. You unwrap quietly, waiting for a moment of distraction, the hiss of brakes, a change in scenery, before taking a bite. The first crunch feels indecently loud. You pause, chewing as silently as possible. Somehow, that makes it worse. The lady with the feathered hat glances your way. There's something almost approving in her eyes, a subtle nod that says, "We're all animals after all." Encouraged, you offer her one of the biscuits. She hesitates, then accepts, holding it delicately between gloved fingers. "Thank you," she whispers, as though you've shared state secrets. The mustached gentleman notices and, realizing he's been excluded from this subversive communion, clears his throat. "Traveling does require sustenance," he mutters, as if granting moral permission. Then he produces his own contraband, a silver flask. The faint scent of brandy drifts through the compartment. You suppress a laugh. So the moralist had a hidden streak after all. Soon, everyone's defenses drop. The young man offers slices of bread. The matron passes around candied ginger for the stomach's steadiness. What began as a crime becomes a feast. Etiquette, that fragile construct, bends under the weight of hunger and camaraderie. You realize this, too, is part of the journey, how discomfort softens boundaries more effectively than any philosophy. Still, even rebellion must follow rules. Crumbs are the enemy. You watch as each person performs small acts of tidying, brushing a lap discreetly, folding wrappers into perfect squares, dabbing at corners of mouths with monogrammed napkins. Civilization insists on leaving no evidence behind. The floor may be strewn with soot, but heaven forbid a crumb betray your humanity. You recall that some stations offered refreshment rooms where travelers could eat decently between connections. The most famous, Swindon, Crewe, York, were both celebrated and mocked. Food critics, yes, even then, described them as scenes of wild confusion, where scalding tea and despair are equally abundant. Historians still debate whether the chaos was due to short meal stops or the British inability to eat quickly. Perhaps both. The train lurches, and a rogue apple rolls down the aisle. It bumps gently into your shoe before anyone can catch it. For a second, time freezes. All eyes follow its path. Then laughter breaks out, quiet at first, then freer. The mustached man chuckles. The young traveler retrieves the apple with exaggerated solemnity. The lady hides her smile behind her veil. It's absurd and wonderful, the perfect antidote to all that restraint. Somewhere between bites, you notice how the act of eating transforms the mood. The compartment, once a chapel of propriety, hums with life. Even the clatter of the rails feels friendlier. There's something deeply human in the sound of shared chewing, an unspoken acknowledgement that, beneath our layers of etiquette, we're just travelers trying not to starve before the next stop. You muse, half sleepily, on how future generations will dine on trains without shame, ordering soup, even wine, while staring at screens. Would Victorians faint at the sight? Perhaps. But perhaps, too, they'd envy the ease, the way manners eventually relaxed into comfort. For now, you savor your final bite of apple, tart and clean after the dusty air. The lady beside you sighs contentedly. "Strange," she murmurs, "how travel makes simple things taste finer." You nod, feeling the truth of it. Maybe that's why these etiquette rules existed, to make even small freedoms feel luxurious. The lights flicker as the train dives into a tunnel. For a moment, everything vanishes. The faces, the food, the pretense. Only the rhythmic hum of wheels remains, ancient and alive. When light returns, crumbs have disappeared, napkins folded neatly, expressions serene. You could almost believe nothing happened. Almost. Because beneath the composure, everyone carries the quiet warmth of shared rebellion, the memory of a meal smuggled past propriety, proof that even in the strictest age, appetite always finds a way. The train rattles on, wheels humming like a lullaby, when a sudden wail pierces the calm. Not the whistle, something smaller, shriller, and infinitely more chaotic. You turn to see the culprit, a toddler, red-faced and determined to declare war on silence. Ah yes, children on Victorian trains. You've entered the realm of unspoken dread. The child's mother, pale with apology, bounces him gently on her lap, whispering pleas that sound more like prayers. The other passengers freeze, performing that classic Victorian act of polite indifference. No one meets her eye, no one dares sigh too loudly. After all, good breeding means pretending nothing is happening, even when a small human is testing the acoustic limits of the carriage. A mainstream historical fact gives context to the mother's suffering. In the mid-19th century, children were expected to embody miniature adulthood in public. No running, no shrieking, no sticky fingers on velvet upholstery. A child's noise, one etiquette manual warned, is a mirror of parental neglect. That's a heavy moral burden for someone barely old enough to pronounce train. The boy's cries crescendo, echoing off polished wood. You notice the lady with the feathered hat gripping her parasol as if preparing for battle. The mustached gentleman shifts uneasily, his mustache twitching like a nervous barometer. You can almost hear their thoughts. Why, oh why, didn't she hire a nursemaid? The truth is, many families did. A well-to-do household traveling with children often brought a governess or child's nurse whose entire job was to keep offspring invisible. The best of them could soothe tantrums with a single glare. The worst joined in the crying. And yet, as historians still argue, the presence of servants on trains blurred class lines. Nothing unsettled Victorian decorum like realizing the maid might sit closer to you than her employer. The child finally hiccups into silence, comforted by a biscuit and a mother's desperate humming. You exhale. So does everyone else, collectively, quietly. The crisis is over. For now. But the peace doesn't last. A rustling sound draws your attention to the far end of the carriage, where a small dog, a terrier with ambitions of grandeur, pokes its head out of a carpet bag. Its owner, a portly gentleman in plaid, pats it fondly. He travels better than most, he boasts. The mustached man frowns. The feathered lady inhales sharply. Pets, it seems, provoke as much debate as politics. A fringe tidbit: some railway companies actually ban dogs from passenger compartments unless they paid their own fare. Tiny tickets were issued to animals, clipped and everything. Larger breeds were confined to luggage vans, where, according to rumor, they howled in solidarity for the entire journey. The Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals once petitioned for canine comfort stops on long routes, though no one could explain how to persuade a dog to disembark and reboard politely. The terrier yawns, unimpressed by history. Its owner feeds it a sliver of ham, sealing his social doom. The lady with the feathered hat tuts, barely audible, but sharp enough to slice through the air. Feeding animals in public was, in Victorian terms, a moral crisis. Still, you can't help but smile at the creature's wagging tail. Amid all the starch and rules, here's something utterly unbothered by etiquette. Across the aisle, the old matron leans toward her neighbor. I once saw a parrot on a train, she whispers conspiratorially. It recited scripture all the way to Bath. You almost choke back a laugh. She isn't joking. A newspaper clipping from 1865 reported precisely that, a parrot of moral inclination that quoted psalms to startled passengers. The Victorians adored eccentric travel companions, as long as they weren't your problem. The train lurches, and the terrier barks once, just once, but loud enough to earn a chorus of glaze. The portly man pretends not to notice, absorbed in imaginary scenery. You catch his eye for a fleeting moment and offer a sympathetic half-smile. In that instant, you understand, traveling with living beings, whether children, dogs, or talking parrots, was an act of social courage. Historians still argue whether these rules of restraint stemmed from genuine concern for comfort or from the obsession with control that defined the Victorian psyche. Every rule, every do not, was a way to hold back the chaos lurking just beyond the train window. A crying child, a barking dog. These were reminders that nature didn't always obey civilization's timetable. The little boy, now calmer, presses his face to the glass, leaving a faint smudge. His mother looks mortified. You give her a small, reassuring nod. He's just admiring the view, you say softly. She smiles, relieved, perhaps a little surprised that anyone would speak kindly instead of sighing. For a moment, propriety loosens its corset. As dusk deepens, the compartment takes on a warm, tired glow. The terrier curls at its owner's feet. The child, spent from his emotional symphony, drifts into sleep. The woman hums again, quieter now, a lullaby threading through the rhythmic rattle of the wheels. You realize the train has transformed from a hall of judgment into something softer, more human. Still, traces of tension remain. When the mother lifts her son onto the seat beside her, careful not to disturb others, the lady with the hat murmurs, "Children should have their own carriages." It's the kind of statement that pretends to be practical but bleeds with privilege. You're tempted to reply, but you don't. You've learned by now that on Victorian trains, silence is both weapon and shield. Outside, the last light fades from the fields, and your reflection merges with the dark. Inside, the air smells faintly of biscuits and damp wool. The mustached man stares, muttering about timetables, and the matron sighs contentedly, still recounting her parrot story to anyone willing to pretend they are listening. You think about all the rules that govern these travelers, how even affection had to be disguised as discipline. But in the soft curve of the mother's arm around her child, in the terrier's snore, you see what survived beneath the starch: warmth, stubborn and untrainable. The boy stares in his sleep and murmurs something unintelligible, his voice small and trusting. You feel the train sway gently, a cradle made of iron and etiquette. Maybe, you think, that's the real story of Victorian travel, not the rules themselves, but how people quietly broke them to stay human. And just as the thought settles, the terrier snorts awake, sneezes twice, and curls back up again, unbothered by history. You envy him deeply. You think, perhaps naively, that the hardest parts of Victorian train travel are behind you, until the next ordeal arrives, tightly laced and impossible to ignore: fashion. You've made it through soot, smells, and screaming infants, but nothing compares to maintaining style at 40 miles per hour in an age when comfort was considered a moral weakness. You shift in your seat, acutely aware of the corset pressing into your ribs, or if you're a gentleman, the collar so stiff it could double as a guillotine. It's the 19th century's grand paradox. People hurt themselves to look composed, then wrote entire books explaining how not to show it. A mainstream historical fact anchors your discomfort. By the 1860s, railway travel had become a stage for social display. Passengers treated their carriages like drawing rooms on wheels. Even second-class travelers were advised to present an appearance of restraint and polish, meaning silk cravats for men, tidy bonnets for women, and absolutely no lounging. Heaven forbid someone catch you slouching. Slouching implied moral decay. You glance around. The lady with the feathered hat still sits perfectly upright, though her face betrays the fatigue of keeping her spine aristocratically aligned for 3 hours straight. Her skirt, light petticoats beneath a bell-shaped gown, spills elegantly across the seat. You suspect she's pinned herself to it for stability. Every bounce of the train tests her poise like a stress rehearsal for sainthood. The mustached gentleman, meanwhile, fusses with his waistcoat buttons. His top hat rests on his knees, trembling slightly with every jolt. Victorians rarely removed hats in public, but long journeys were one of the few exceptions. Even so, they had to cradle the thing as though it contained a sacred relic. You, too, adjust your coat, trying to keep the creases from turning mutinous. The air feels thick with starch, perfume, and self-control. Everyone's posture suggests they'd rather perish elegantly than admit to discomfort. Historians still argue whether these layers of finery were a triumph of aesthetic devotion or a slow-motion endurance test. Some claim fashion was a form of armor, a way to project respectability in a rapidly industrializing world. Others suggest it was simple vanity wrapped in moral justification. Either way, no one on this train looks truly comfortable. The train jerks suddenly as it hits a curve. You grab the seat for balance. Across from you, a gentleman's hat launches off his lap, rolling down the aisle like a runaway wheel of cheese. Gasps erupt. A hat on the floor is a social emergency. The poor man scrambles after it, red-faced, while the old matron whispers, "Mercy, his dignity." When he finally retrieves it, he dusts it off with such solemnity you'd think he were performing a baptism. The crisis passes, but you can feel the collective pulse of relief. In this era, fashion accidents are no laughing matter, they are moral slip-ups. Still, not all attire disasters come from the men. A gust from the half-open window catches the lady's veil, whipping it across her face like an angry ghost. She yelps, tries to fix it without revealing too much wrist, heaven forbid, and ends up laughing quietly at herself. The sound, a brief, human giggle, breaks through the starch. You laugh too, softly. The mustached man pretends not to notice but smiles behind his newspaper. For once, etiquette makes room for humanity. A fringe tidbit floats through your mind. In 1856, a London tailor tried to market railway dresses made of lightweight, soot-resistant fabric. They were supposed to make travel more practical for women. Unfortunately, they were also hideous. Newspapers dubbed them locomotive sacks. The idea died quickly, though the inventor insisted posterity would vindicate him. It didn't. You imagine modern commuters in yoga pants and hoodies, and wonder what Victorians would say. Probably something like, "The end of civilization." Yet, here they were, corseted and choking, enduring their own version of elegance's tyranny. The train sways again, and you glimpse your reflection in the darkened window. Even through smudges of soot and fatigue, there's something noble about it, a person trying, against all odds, to stay immaculate in motion. Maybe that's the essence of Victorian dignity, the illusion that you're perfectly fine, even when your shoes are cutting off circulation. You adjust your gloves, grateful at least for the small barrier they provide between you and the grime. Gloves were sacred. No decent traveler touched anything barehanded if they could help it. They were fashion, hygiene, and class signal all at once. A torn glove could ruin reputations faster than gossip. You check yours, still intact. You've survived worse. The mustached man begins talking quietly about tailoring, something about the superiority of London tweed over continental fabrics. The lady listens politely, nodding as though he's revealing trade secrets. You catch snippets about proper button placement and respectable drape. It's oddly soothing, this shared obsession with trivial perfection. You realize that in a world without fast fashion or central heating, clothes were identity, armor, and conversation starter all at once. As night deepens, the compartment glows amber under the oil lamps. Shadows ripple across brocade, lace, and polished boots. Everyone looks faintly theatrical, as though posing for a painting titled Passengers Enduring Decorum. You imagine how posterity might see you, a tiny figure frozen in soot and satin, proof that even ordinary people once dressed like museum exhibits. Historians still debate whether these railway fashions democratized elegance or exaggerated inequality. Trains made travel accessible, but not equality. A third-class traveler's coat might mimic an aristocrat's cut, yet one whiff of cheaper wool gave the game away. Etiquette was the thread that bound appearances to class. Even the angle of your hat brim could betray your social origins. You smile at the thought, how strange it is that everyone here is performing civility while the world outside hurtles toward change. Steam, steel, and soot are rewriting the future, yet inside the carriage, fashion still clings to the past, corseted and proud. As the train begins to slow for the next station, passengers stir, smoothing fabrics, tightening ribbons, and straightening collars. The ritual is almost religious. To arrive disheveled is to arrive disgraced. You brush invisible dust from your lapels, though you know the real dirt is everywhere, under your nails, in your lungs, on your very soul. Still, you perform the gesture. Everyone does. It's what keeps the illusion alive. The whistle blows, long and mournful. Outside, the station lamps appear, small halos in the dark. You see reflections of yourself and the others, weary, elegant, human. For all the starch and suffering, there's beauty in their effort, a quiet defiance of the industrial chaos roaring just beyond the glass. You think, as the brakes squeal and hats are steadied, that maybe this is the heart of 19th century train etiquette, not the rules themselves, but the resolve to remain graceful when the world is shaking beneath your feet. The train halts, a puff of steam enveloping the platform. Somewhere, a child yawns, a dog barks, and a veil flutters. The doors open with a sigh. No one rushes, that would be indecorous. You rise, straighten your coat, and step carefully forward, one gloved hand balancing against the motion. Dignity intact. Barely. You think you've mastered the etiquette of endurance, sitting straight, breathing soot with grace, surviving fashion's torture devices. But the 19th century railway still has one more trick up its starched sleeve: deception. Tonight's lesson is in ticket scandals, fare cheats, and the curious art of pretending to be someone you're not. It begins innocently enough. The conductor strides into the compartment, lantern swinging, uniform crisp as an officer's. He carries authority the way other men carry pocket watches, heavy, visible, and faintly self-satisfied. "Tickets, please," he intones, and immediately, you sense the collective tightening of spines. In this tiny theater of propriety, a ticket is more than paper, it's a passport to your social rank. You produce yours promptly, trying not to smudge it. The lady with the feathered hat does the same, slipping it from her reticule as delicately as if unveiling a secret. The mustached gentleman hands over his with the air of a man submitting proof of nobility. All routine, until the young man in the corner hesitates. A flicker of panic crosses his face, quickly disguised by a smile. He fumbles in his coat pocket, pulls out a ticket that looks aged. The conductor's eyebrow arches, the lantern's light catching a faint tear in the paper. "Third class," the conductor says. "And yet, sir, you are in second." A hush falls over the compartment. The matron gasps softly, clutching her parasol like a moral weapon. The lady's eyes widen behind her veil. The mustached man straightens, ready for scandal. "You, of course, pretend not to care, but you absolutely do. The young man stammers, mumbling something about a mistake at the station. The conductor remains unmoved, his mustache twitching with quiet triumph. Mistakes, he says, do not board second-class carriages. And there it is, the Victorian creed, uttered with bureaucratic grace. A mainstream historical fact gives this drama its edge. Fare evasion was a common, if daring, sport in the 19th century. Some travelers bought third-class tickets but snuck into higher compartments, hoping inspectors wouldn't notice. Others borrowed tickets from friends or bribed porters for favorable placement. The penalties ranged from public shame to fines that could bankrupt a clerk. It was the era's genteel version of sneaking into first-class Wi-Fi. Historians still argue whether these cheats were acts of rebellion against rigid class structures or simple opportunism. One camp sees them as proto-social justice warriors, sneaking equality one carriage at a time. Another insists they were just freeloaders in cravats. Watching the young man's nervous grin, you suspect a bit of both. The conductor, following protocol, requests payment for the fare difference. The young man produces a few coins, too few. Then I'm afraid, the conductor says, you must disembark at the next station. It sounds like a sentence from a Victorian courtroom drama. You can almost hear the invisible audience gasp. But then something unexpected happens. The lady with the feathered hat clears her throat. It's late, she says softly, and the next stop is hardly civilized. Let him stay. A murmur ripples through the compartment. The mustached gentleman grumbles but doesn't object. The conductor hesitates, his lantern flickers as if the light itself is considering mercy. Finally, he nods curtly. For this once. The young man exhales, whispering gratitude. You catch his eye, and he gives a small, embarrassed smile. The train lurches forward again, crisis averted, propriety bruised but breathing. You feel oddly proud of your compartment. Maybe etiquette can bend without breaking. A fringe tidbit surfaces in your mind. Some women in the 1880s disguised themselves as men to travel alone more safely, or more cheaply. Dressed in trousers and false whiskers, they slipped into carriages unnoticed, tasting a brief, illicit freedom. One was even caught in 1889, her disguise betrayed by a poorly glued mustache that drooped mid-journey. Newspapers called her the Lady of the Lopsided Lip. You imagine the scandal and smile. As the train rumbles on, conversation resumes cautiously. The mustached gentleman mutters about the decay of standards. The matron, ever dramatic, declares, "What is the empire coming to?" The lady, still gazing out the window, only says, "Perhaps it's coming to its senses." Her tone is mild, but her meaning sharp enough to slice wallpaper. You admire her bravery. The conductor exits, lantern swinging, leaving behind the faint scent of oil and authority. The compartment relaxes, shoulders loosening, tension dissolving into the steady rhythm of the wheels. The young man leans back, closing his eyes with relief. For all the rigidity of the age, small acts of leniency still slip through the cracks. Historians still debate whether Victorian morality was truly moral or merely performative. Did people behave out of principle or fear of being caught? Watching your companions, you sense the truth lies somewhere in between. Etiquette wasn't just a system, it was theater. Everyone played their part, hoping the audience approved. You glance at your own ticket again, neatly folded, perfectly valid. Yet you feel a strange envy for the rule breaker. He risked embarrassment for a taste of freedom, a better seat, maybe even a better story. And in this world of polished surfaces and stifled conversation, a story feels more valuable than comfort. Outside, the darkness stretches endlessly, pieced by the rhythmic flashes of telegraph poles. Inside, the compartment feels smaller now, more intimate. A shared secret hums beneath the polite silence. The lady fidgets with her veil. The young man pretends to read. The mustached gentleman hums disapprovingly, though you suspect he'll be recounting this tale over brandy later. Everyone loves a scandal, as long as it's someone else's. You think about the strange morality of it all, how a tiny scrap of paper could dictate who you were allowed to sit beside, who could judge you, and how loudly. Maybe the real fare wasn't in money but in manners, the endless tax of pretending to belong. The train slows for another station. A porter's whistle echoes faintly, followed by the hiss of brakes. The young man stands, eager to disappear before the conductor changes his mind. He tips his hat toward the lady. "Thank you," he says softly. She nods once, her expression unreadable. Then he steps into the mist and vanishes into the blur of lamps and steam. The doors close. The wheels start again. You watch the empty seat, still warm from his defiance, and can't help thinking that Victorian trains were full of ghosts like him. People pretending, escaping, improvising their way through a world obsessed with order. As the countryside slides past, the lady turns to you and says, "He'll tell that story for years." You nod. "So will we." And with that, the carriage falls quiet once more, the only sound the relentless, forgiving rhythm of steel on steel, counting secrets, keeping time. The train is quieter now, almost reverent, as though it knows the scandal has passed but the echoes of judgment still hover in the air. You sit back, watching the amber light from the carriage lamps shimmer against polished brass fittings. You'd think, after witnessing a ticket fraud, the passengers might loosen up, perhaps even shower a conspiratorial smile. But this is the 19th century, and smiles are as risky as sins. Tonight's lesson, affection, or rather, the elaborate avoidance of it. Victorian train etiquette dictated that public affection was the fastest route to ruin. Forget grand passions or whispered endearments, even a shied glance could be loaded with insinuation. A gentleman who let his gaze linger too long might find himself labeled a libertine. A lady whose hand brushed a stranger's knee, no matter how accidental, risked being judged for life. The rails carried more than passengers, they carried reputation. The compartment creaks as the train rounds a bend, and across from you, the lady with the feathered hat adjusts her gloves. The motion is innocent enough, but you catch the faintest tremor in her fingers. You realize she's aware of every inch of space between herself and the mustached man beside her. There's enough room to fit propriety itself, barely. A mainstream historical fact comes to mind. In 1858, railway companies in Britain introduced ladies-only carriages to protect women from harassment. Officially, they were designed for comfort and safety. Unofficially, they were an admission that trains made people nervous. Too many strangers, too much proximity, too few chaperones. Some men protested the segregation, calling it un-English. Some women welcomed it, calling it a relief. Historians still argue whether those carriages were progressive sanctuaries or gilded cages. In this mixed compartment, though, there is no sanctuary, only the constant choreography of distance. A glove dropped is retrieved with surgical precision. A cough is covered quickly, lest it sound too intimate. Even the act of speaking risks exposure. Politeness is protection. You lean back, listening to the train's lullaby rhythm, and imagine what would happen if someone dared to break the silence. Perhaps a whispered compliment, "Your hat is most becoming tonight." Seems harmless enough. Yet in Victorian terms, it might as well be a marriage proposal shouted across Parliament. A fringe tidbit flickers through your mind. Etiquette manuals of the 1870s warned women never to meet a man's eyes for more than 3 seconds on a train. 3 seconds, apparently, was the threshold between courtesy and invitation. You test the theory silently, watching your reflection in the darkened window. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3, yep. You feel scandalous already. The lady with the feathered hat, perhaps feeling the same tension, retrieves a small book from her bag. It's bound in green leather, with gilt edges. You recognize the title, Etiquette of the Railway Passenger, one of those dreadful pocket guides that tried to legislate human behavior down to the way one sneezed. She flips through it idly, as though seeking reassurance. The mustached man pretends not to notice, though his mustache twitches in amusement. Outside, the landscape slides by in a blur of moonlit hedgerows. Inside, the air feels charged with restraint. You imagine all the unsaid words floating between the passengers, like faint sparks that will never ignite. Historians still debate whether Victorian restraint was sincere morality or performative repression. Some argue that all this self-control created emotional depth. Others say it produced neuroses. You suspect both might be true. Repression, after all, is just passion with good posture. Then something surprising happens. The train jolts sharply, one of those violent lurches that seem designed purely to humiliate human dignity. The lady loses her balance, pitching slightly toward the mustached man. Instinctively, he steadies her by the elbow. The touch lasts no longer than a heartbeat. But in that brief, forbidden instant, time seems to hold its breath. Their eyes meet. Hairs widen, his soften. It's not romance, not quite, but something older and simpler, human contact, honest and uncalculated. The moment passes as quickly as it arrives. She straightens, murmuring thank you, and withdraws her arm. The mustached man nods, then clears his throat into his fist, returning to the fortress of his newspaper. But the carriage has changed. You feel it. Everyone does. The air is warmer now, as though that brief brush of fingers cracked the shell of propriety just enough for life to seep through. The matron pretends to adjust her shawl, but you catch her smiling faintly, perhaps remembering a touch of her own long ago. Even the ticking of the ceiling lamp seems slower, softer. A faint laugh bubbles in your chest. You suppress it, of course. This is no place for amusement, but still, you can't help thinking of how absurd it all is. People crossing continents in steam-powered miracles, yet terrified of their own hands. A memory from earlier in the journey drifts back. The scandalized whispers over a fallen hat, the delicate choreography of veils and gloves. It all fits the same pattern. Control everything, feel nothing, appear perfect. But here, in this flickering carriage, you've seen how fragile that mask really is. The train plunges into a tunnel. The lamps flicker, shadows jump, and for a few heartbeats, the compartment becomes an island of near darkness. Someone inhales sharply, someone else exhales. The sound of wheels against tracks fills the void. You can almost sense people shrinking into themselves, afraid of what might happen in the dark. In truth, most of the Victorian obsession with propriety came from fear of being misread, misunderstood, mistaken. The railway, with its mingled classes and anonymous encounters, was the perfect stage for that anxiety. Letters to newspapers complained of unseemly behavior in dimly lit compartments. One woman wrote in 1873 that the darkness of tunnels is a moral hazard equal to gin. You smile at that, imagine comparing a tunnel to a tavern. But she wasn't entirely wrong, both loosened the tongue and blurred the rules. When the train bursts back into moonlight, everyone looks studiously out the window, pretending the tunnel never happened. The lady reopens her book. The mustached man fakes deep interest in an advertisement for hair tonic. The matron hums faintly, off-key, as if to reset the world. You, however, can't unsee what you've seen. A touch, a breath, a glance. It's not much, but in the code of Victorian etiquette, it's rebellion. You wonder if the lady feels it too, that tiny thrill of forbidden reality beneath her glove. Perhaps that's why she turns a page too quickly, or why her cheeks glow slightly warmer than the lamps. Historians will debate it, of course, they always do, but you know better. Affection, like steam, finds a way through the smallest cracks. Outside, the train races on, slicing through the night. Inside, people sit inches apart, hearts carefully locked, every movement measured and mannered. But for all their composure, you can feel the undercurrent, a quiet, pulsing truth that no etiquette manual could ever regulate. The lady sighs softly, her eyes closing for just a moment. The mustached man looks away, pretending not to notice. You look out into the dark and imagine all the tiny, forbidden moments happening across the railway network tonight. Glances in third class, shy smiles in first, maybe even a secret kiss behind a velvet curtain. The thought is both tender and tragic. You lean back, the rhythm of the train syncing with your heartbeat. The air smells faintly of coal, perfume, and possibility. Somewhere deep down, you know that even in an age obsessed with control, affection always finds its carriage. You hear the steady click of boots before you see him, the conductor, returning once again, that eternal sentinel of order. His lantern swings at his side, throwing arcs of amber light along the polished brass rails. His uniform, dark and pressed, catches the glow like a blade. You've started to realize that these men, conductors, porters, guards, are more than mere employees. They are the keepers of civilization on wheels, the enforcers of what Victorians politely called decorum, and what you might more accurately call behavioral surveillance with extra buttons. The door slides open with a sigh. "Tickets once more, please." His tone is polite but absolute. You hand yours over, already knowing he'll inspect it as if reading your soul through the ink. Around you, other passengers follow suit. Nervous smiles, quick glances, the ritual of submission. In a world built on hierarchy, even a train ticket is a moral contract. You watch him work. Every motion is precise, every question delivered with bureaucratic gentleness. "Your destination, madam?" "Indeed, sir, this route continues to Birmingham." "No, sir, you may not smoke while the lady is present." The mustached man stiffens, mid-puff, caught like a schoolboy hiding contraband. The conductor's gaze is calm but immovable. A gentleman would never argue. Instead, he crushes the cigar stub out in a silver case, murmuring a deferential apology. A mainstream historical fact hums behind this moment. Victorian railway staff were among the most strictly trained workers in the empire. Companies issued conductors with etiquette manuals thicker than some novels. Porters were expected to bow at the correct angle, use the correct form of address, and maintain spotless uniforms, even in blizzards. One popular 1870s guide insisted that a guard's manners are the mirror of the line's respectability. In short, be as polite as a duke, and as feared as one. But you also notice something more subtle. The passengers respond to these uniformed men with a curious mix of awe and resentment. The lady with the feathered hat straightens instinctively, like a schoolgirl before a stern teacher. The matron presses her lips together, perhaps recalling a past argument with a porter over lost luggage. Everyone knows the unspoken rule. These men could ruin your journey, but they'd do it smiling. Historians still argue whether such railway discipline was genuine civility or just industrial control disguised as courtesy. Was the conductor truly polite, or merely performing deference to keep the machine running smoothly? Maybe both. You suspect even he isn't sure anymore. His politeness seems worn into him like the shine on his boots, a habit, not a choice. The train rocks slightly, and the conductor steadies himself with one gloved hand on the door frame. You glimpse the faintest trace of fatigue in his eyes. Perhaps he's been on duty since dawn. Victorian timetables were brutal. 12-hour shifts, no rest, constant vigilance. A single error could mean disaster. The newspapers loved to print stories of heroic guards who saved trains from calamity, though they rarely mentioned how many fell asleep on their feet. He moves on, checking the lamps, adjusting the blinds, ensuring every minor thing remains perfectly in place. It's an act of control against chaos, small rituals keeping the railway gods appeased. And yet, beneath the surface, you sense how fragile it all is. The train jerks again. From another carriage comes a muffled argument, a man shouting about lost luggage, a porter's firm reply. The conductor tilts his head, listening, then sighs softly and steps out. His boots echo down the corridor like punctuation marks. A fringe tidbit bubbles up. Some conductors in the 19th century were known as gentlemen of the rails, minor celebrities in their own right. There was one on the Great Western Line, nicknamed Sir Whistle, who was said to have memoized the favorite tea preferences of all his first-class regulars. Another carried a pet canary that whistled whenever someone lied about their fare. You suspect both stories have been polished by nostalgia, but you rather like them anyway. The lady beside you leans closer. "Do you ever wonder," she whispers, "if they enjoy the power?" You nod slightly. Of course they do. Who wouldn't? To command obedience from the rich, to keep order in a moving microcosm of society, it must feel intoxicating. But then again, it's a delicate dance. Too stern, and passengers complain. Too lenient, and chaos reigns. These men live balanced between obedience and authority, decorum and dominance. The conductor returns, smoothing his cuffs. The argument, it seems, has been resolved. The gentleman's bag was found in the wrong van, he reports evenly. Peace has been restored. You catch the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth. Humor, perhaps, or the private satisfaction of one who's just wrestled the world back into order. Historians still debate whether Victorian trains represented democracy in motion or discipline on wheels. You lean toward the latter. Everything about this world, the tickets, the uniforms, the rules, feels designed to remind passengers that even in motion, hierarchy remains immovable. The train may connect cities, but it also connects authority to the very rhythm of travel. And yet, you can't help but admire the pageantry. The conductor's final check is almost ceremonial, a tug at the bell cord, a nod to the engineer, a tap of the whistle. The train responds with a long, melodic sigh, steam curling around the lamps like breath on a winter morning. For a moment, you see him not as an enforcer but as a kind of priest, presiding over this temple of motion, where iron and etiquette meet. You lean back and watch as he exits the carriage, his lantern glow shrinking down the corridor. The passengers collectively exhale, freed once more from scrutiny. The mustached man retrieves his cigar stub, the lady adjusts her veil, the matron mutters about the arrogance of uniforms. But you? You feel oddly comforted. Someone, at least, is steering this floating civilization. Outside, darkness swallows the landscape. Inside, the compartment hums with the muted dignity of the well-behaved. The rhythm of the train settles into its heartbeat pattern, steady, relentless, soothing. You imagine the network of railways stretching across the country, every carriage like a tiny kingdom of etiquette, each conductor its monarch. As the wheels sing against the rails, you realize something simple but profound. Victorian decorum wasn't just about manners. It was about survival in a world that moved faster than people knew how to feel. The conductors, the porters, even the passengers, they were all holding back the chaos with nothing but civility and the occasional polished whistle. The lady sighs contentedly, as though sensing the order restored. "We're safe again," she murmurs. You nod, watching the flicker of the conductor's lantern vanish into the next car. Safe, yes, but only as long as the rules hold. The train thunders on, a perfect machine of obedience hurtling through the sleeping countryside. And you, lulled by its rhythm, begin to understand. In this age, politeness wasn't optional. It was the last line between progress and pandemonium. The rhythm of the wheels has a way of lulling you into calm, until it doesn't. A sudden, distant clang, maybe a loose coupling or an echo from another train, jolts the compartment like a ghost knocking politely before entering. The passengers exchange brief glances, then pretend nothing happened. You sense the shared superstition that runs through every Victorian traveller: never speak of accidents while aboard. To do so is to tempt fate. You stare into the dark glass of the window. Outside, the night rolls past in blurs of grey and silver, and for a moment you imagine shapes moving along the embankment, shadows that don't quite match the rhythm of trees. Perhaps it's fatigue. Or perhaps it's the ghosts that always seem to follow trains in the 19th century. A mainstream historical fact offers itself as comfort, or maybe warning. By 1870, railway accidents were distressingly common. Broken rails, faulty signals, and the new, frightening speed of locomotives all contributed to a steady drumbeat of catastrophe. The Clayton Tunnel crash of 1861 killed 23 people. The Armagh disaster of 1889 took 80. The papers described them in almost gothic tones, the screams of steam and flesh. One headline read, "So that reading about a crash became a macabre ritual over breakfast." Still, people kept boarding. Steam was addictive. Historians still argue whether the Victorians' fascination with railway accidents reflected morbid curiosity or genuine technological fear. You think it was both. These were people raised on hymns and horse carts suddenly catapulted into an age of roaring machines. Every trip was half miracle, half gamble. The mustached gentleman clears his throat. They say, he murmurs, that some nights you can still hear the Brighton train. The lady beside him frowns faintly, unsure whether to scold or listen. Nonsense, the matron says, though her voice lacks conviction. He continues anyway, clearly relishing the tiny rebellion of storytelling. The Clayton Tunnel crash, he says. 2 trains, 1 tunnel, 1 lantern too dim. They say the second driver saw the ghost of the first waving his lamp too late. He smiles thinly. Of course, one mustn't believe such things. The compartment grows quieter. You find yourself listening despite yourself, lulled by the hum of his voice against the rattle of wheels. You realize something peculiar. Trains, so modern and mechanical, gave birth to their own folklore almost immediately. Ghosts clung to them like soot. A fringe tidbit surfaces from your mental scrapbook. In 1862, a psychic medium named Mrs. Guppy claimed to have channeled the spirit of a deceased railway guard during a séance in Bloomsbury. The ghost supposedly complained that etiquette was better enforced below than above, implying even the afterlife had its rules. People paid extra to attend her next session. The lady with the feathered hat shivers delicately. "You shouldn't tell such tales on a journey," she says, her tone soft but scolding. It unsettles the ladies. The gentleman bows his apology, though the twinkle in his eye suggests he's not entirely sorry. You suspect he enjoys the discomfort. Victorian men often mistook suspense for charm. You lean against the window pane, cool and slightly damp, and think of how superstition rides shotgun with progress. The Victorians prided themselves on reason, yet they built entire mythologies around the machines they worshipped. Every tunnel became a throat of darkness, every whistle a cry of warning, every flicker of light in the distance a phantom signal. The train whistles, long and mournful, and for a second, you feel the sound in your ribs. There's something ancient about it, like the wail of a cathedral organ mixed with a beast's breath. You imagine how, to travelers of the 1800s, that sound must have carried both promise and terror, the voice of speed itself, calling them forward into the unknown. The matron crosses herself discreetly. God keep us, she mutters. The lady turns away, pretending to read her etiquette manual again. The mustached man hums an old tune under his breath, perhaps to banish the tension. You almost laugh, so many defenses against invisible things. Historians still debate how these ghostly tales shaped the era's psyche. Some believe they were a coping mechanism, a way to humanize tragedy through narrative. Others see them as resistance, folk spirituality clinging stubbornly to rational times. Either way, they gave the railway a strange dual identity, marvel by day, haunting by night. The oil lamps flicker as the train hits a stretch of uneven track. Shadows lurch across the compartment like restless spirits. You tell yourself it's just the motion, just physics. But when the light steadies again, you notice something unnerving. The empty seat at the far end, where the young fair cheetah once sat, now seems oddly darker than the rest. Not empty, occupied by absence. You blink, shake your head. Too much soot in the lungs, too little sleep. But still, the shadow lingers. The train's rhythm changes slightly, a deeper groan in the wheels, a longer exhale of steam. The lady senses it too. You can tell by the way her gloved hand tightens around her book. Superstitions, she says suddenly, forcing a laugh. They are for children. You nod, but the sound of your own heartbeat feels loud enough to count as proof otherwise. Another tidbit drifts into memory. Railway companies used to hold ghost train excursions on Halloween, especially after dark disasters. The public loved them. Imagine, Victorian families paying good money to be terrified in controlled circumstances, much like modern thrill seekers at haunted houses. Even then, people seemed to crave the safety of fear. The mustached man, now properly in storytelling mode, adds one more whisper. They also say, he murmurs, that if you travel alone at night, and you see a figure waving a red lamp along the tracks, don't wave back. The lady stiffens. Why not? He smiles grimly. Because it's never there to stop your train, it's there to warn you of the one you missed. You can almost hear the smile in the dark. The matron huffs disapprovingly. Ghastly talk, she says. Utterly unrefined. But her eyes dart toward the window all the same. The train enters a curve, the lamps swaying. Outside, the moon reflects briefly off something metallic near the embankment. Perhaps a signal post, perhaps something else. You feel your chest tighten as the reflection vanishes. Then, just as quickly, the landscape returns to its usual calm emptiness. You release a slow breath. The superstition lingers, though, like the scent of coal. You think of all those accidents, all those lost souls, all that progress built on trembling rails. Maybe every train carries its ghosts, not as phantoms, but as memories pressed into the iron. The lady's book slips slightly from her lap, pages fluttering like wings. She catches it, smiling awkwardly. My hands are cold, she murmurs. You nod in understanding, though yours are no steadier. Outside, the countryside blurs again into peace. Inside, the compartment softens. The conductor passes by once more, lantern steady, gaze professional. No ghosts follow him. Maybe that's all the reassurance you need. The wheels keep their rhythm. Click, click, click. A heartbeat you can trust. And just like that, the tension fades, replaced by the familiar comfort of civility. But still, as you glance at the shadowed corner one last time, you can't help but think, perhaps the most peculiar etiquette of all was never to admit when you were afraid. The night has grown velvety and deep, the lamps inside your carriage glowing like softened moons. The ghosts have retreated, at least, the literal ones, but another kind of haunting lingers, the ones that come from longing. It's strange, you think, how all this decorum, all this order and etiquette, only seems to make human emotion more desperate to slip through the cracks. You're about to learn the most delicate rule of all, how to love, or at least pretend not to, on a 19th century train. You feel it first in the silence. It's not quite awkward, not quite comfortable, something suspended in between. The lady with the feathered hat has abandoned her etiquette book. The mustached man's newspaper lies folded in his lap. Even the matron has stopped fidgeting with her parasol. The air feels charged, like the quiet before a confession. You shift slightly, sensing that this compartment, like so many others across the railways of Europe, is quietly staging its own romance. Not the kind with sweeping gestures or whispered promises, but the subtle theater of almosts, hands brushing over luggage straps, stolen glances caught in lamplight, polite smiles that linger too long to remain polite. A mainstream historical fact surfaces. By the 1880s, trains had become one of the most scandalous and secret places for courtship. Couples met between stations, exchanged letters folded into handkerchiefs, even carved initials into carriage panels. Newspapers denounced it as the decline of civilized conduct, which of course only made it more popular. After all, what better way to float than in motion, when the world outside blurred and propriety couldn't quite keep up? Historians still argue whether this railway flotation was a sign of emancipation or moral decay. Some call it an early expression of female independence, women finally meeting strangers on their own terms, away from chaperones and drawing rooms. Others, predictably, called it the downfall of decency by timetable. But as the train hums beneath you, you suspect it was simpler than that. The rails offered privacy disguised as public space. For once, desire didn't need a ballroom, it just needed a delay. The mustached man clears his throat softly. His voice, when it comes, is quiet enough that you almost miss it under the rumble of the train. You travel often. The lady's reply is equally soft. Not usually. But the air of movement helps me think. He nods, pretending to study the brass frame of the window. Yes. The motion does that. It unsettles the still parts of us. It's the kind of exchange that could mean everything or nothing, depending on who's listening. The matron pretends not to hear, staring resolutely into the dark. You suspect she's silently judging them both and herself for wanting to listen anyway. The train lurches slightly, and the lady's gloved hand slips from her lap. The man reacts instantly, steadying it with his own. Just like before, it's a fleeting contact, but this time, neither pulls away immediately. For one heartbeat, maybe two, their fingers rest together, suspended between manners and meaning. You can almost hear the collective breath of the compartment. Then, with the gentlest motion, the lady retrieves her hand. "Thank you," she says. Her tone is perfectly calm, but her cheeks are not. A fringe tidbit stays in your memory. Some railway companies employed matrons of decorum, women hired specifically to monitor the behavior of unaccompanied ladies in first-class compartments. Their job was to ensure no impropriety occurred, which, naturally, meant they witnessed plenty. One memoir from 1884 recalls a matron who confiscated a letter mid-handoff, only to return it later after reading it herself. "The handwriting was charming," she reportedly said. You glance at the lady's hands, folded now with exaggerated composure. You wonder what letters she's received, or written, during her travels. The 19th century was a golden age of correspondence. Lovers measured their devotion not by kisses but by penmanship. Some even sent hair clippings sealed in envelopes, as if love could survive better in fragments. Perhaps, you think, there's one in her reticule right now, a tiny relic of someone waiting at another station. The mustached man, meanwhile, seems lost in thought. His cigar remains unlit in his fingers, forgotten. You sense in him that peculiar Victorian blend of restraint and yearning, a man taught to suppress everything but ambition, now undone by proximity and perfume. Historians still debate whether the train accelerated modern intimacy or merely disguised it. After all, for the first time, people could meet strangers without the filtering presence of family, clergy, or class. Compartments became confessional booths, and journeys became chapters in private novels that society would never print. Outside, the countryside stretches endlessly, the moon now a pale coin above the hedgerows. Inside, you feel the quiet pulse of shared humanity, the absurd, glorious ache of wanting something forbidden just enough to feel alive. You remember that the Victorians adored coded language. Lovers used flowers, fans, even ticket stubs to send secret messages. A rose pressed between book pages meant yes. A handkerchief dropped near someone's shoe meant wait for me. A deliberate delay in boarding the train meant I'll risk being late, if you'll notice. You wonder how many such gestures have passed unseen tonight, even in this small compartment. The train slows for a station, lamps glowing faintly outside. A porter appears at the window, shouting destinations. No one moves. The air feels too heavy with unfinished conversation. When the train lurches forward again, the mustached man finally speaks. "Strange thing, isn't it?" he murmurs, "how motion makes silence louder." The lady looks up, her eyes soft and steady. Perhaps silence travels better than words. And there it is, the kind of exchange that belongs to railway romance. Brief, profound, and destined to fade like smoke. Neither smiles. Neither looks away. They just exist, suspended between stations and centuries, in a small bubble of understanding that etiquette can't quite name. You glance toward the window again, where your reflection trembles in the glass. You, too, have been drawn into the rhythm of this unspoken story. Maybe every passenger is. Love, after all, is the one rule no conductor can enforce and no etiquette manual can fully suppress. The matron coughs delicately, the universal Victorian signal for this conversation ends now. The lady turns her gaze downward, the man adjusts his cuffs. The train rumbles on, propriety restored, at least on the surface. But you can feel it. Beneath the polished manners, something glows faintly. A flicker of rebellion. A warmth that refuses to die, even in the cold machinery of the age. Historians might reduce it to sociology, but you know better. The railway didn't just connect cities, it connected hearts that were never meant to meet. Every puff of steam carried a secret. Every whistle echoed with possibility. Outside, the fields roll past in silver silence. Inside, the lamps hum softly. The lady leans her head against the window, eyes half closed. The mustached man watches her reflection instead of her face. You close your eyes too, thinking that somewhere in another carriage, another pair of strangers might be repeating this same quiet dance, bound by motion, liberated by etiquette's thin leash. And maybe, when they part at dawn, they'll remember nothing more than the rhythm of the train, and how for a few fleeting hours, the world let them feel something unnamed. The train hums into the final stretch of night, its iron lungs sighing against the cool air. You can feel the world changing outside, the faint pulse of electric lamps replacing oil light, the scent of soot giving way to something cleaner, colder. Civilization is shedding its lace gloves. You, meanwhile, are still watching the dim carriage around you, where etiquette clings stubbornly to the edges like frost that hasn't realized its morning. The lady with the feathered hat has fallen asleep, her head tilted gently against the window, her breath fogging the glass. The mustached man sits opposite her, motionless but alert, pretending to read a timetable he's likely memorized hours ago. The matron has succumbed to slumber too, her parasol drooping like a wilted flower. You are the only one still awake, caught in that peculiar border between vigilance and dream, between steam and silence. It occurs to you that you've traveled through more than distance tonight. You've passed through the peculiar heart of a century obsessed with appearances, where every sneeze required permission, and every glance carried consequence. And yet, despite all those stiff collars and stricter rules, people somehow found ways to be human. They coughed, flirted, disobeyed, dreamed. A mainstream historical fact settles in your mind. By the turn of the 20th century, railway etiquette was already dissolving. Carriages grew more democratic, mixed-class seating became common, and with the arrival of electric lighting and cleaner tracks, the grimy romance of steam faded. The train, once a theatre of manners, became an everyday necessity. Progress, it turns out, has little patience for ritual. But even as it vanished, that old code left its fingerprints everywhere, in the way people still whisper on night journeys, in the instinct to offer a stranger a seat, in the half-forgotten courtesy of holding a door. You realize that etiquette isn't gone, it's just quieter, folded into muscle memory. Historians still argue whether the collapse of 19th-century decorum was a loss or a liberation. Some mourn it as the death of grace. Others celebrate it as the birth of authenticity. You find yourself somewhere in the middle. Grace has its charm, but truth breathes easier. The train slows as dawn begins to leak into the horizon. Pale pink light spills across the compartment, softening the lines of everyone's faces. The lady stirs, blinking herself awake. The mustached man nods politely, his expression carefully blank. For a moment, you see them as they truly are, tired travelers bound by time, unmasked at last. A fringe tidbit crosses your mind, one last whisper from the age of steam. In 1899, a London newspaper reported a curious superstition among railway staff, that the last passenger to leave a night train should always look back into the empty carriage before stepping off. Not for lost belongings, but out of respect for those who journey unseen. You wonder if it's sentimentality or something more, a final bow to the ghosts of etiquette, the unseen passengers of civility. You reach the station just as the sun stretches its first real light across the platform. Porters stir, luggage thuds, pigeons scatter. The lady gathers her things with quiet efficiency, careful not to brush against the sleeping matron. The mustached man helps her lower her bag, his gesture practiced, almost ritualistic. They exchange a nod that says everything and nothing. Then, like proper Victorians, they part without a word. You step down next, boots meeting the stone platform. The air smells faintly of iron and rain. Around you, the city awakens, horses clattering, vendors shouting, the first electric streetcar humming in the distance. The old world hasn't vanished yet, but it's thinning, like smoke fading into morning air. You pause before leaving, glancing back through the carriage window. The seats are empty now, the cushions indented where lives briefly touched. A glove lies forgotten on the floor, pale and delicate. It's such a small thing, but you hesitate to return it. Some part of you feels the train should keep it, a token, perhaps, for the unseen company of the past. The conductor calls for clearance. The engine hisses one last time, a tired dragon exhaling its final dream. You watch it glide away, the smoke unraveling into light. It feels, oddly, like a farewell. Not to people, but to a kind of world. One that believed in rules strong enough to hold back chaos, even if only for the length of a journey. And now, as you stand on the platform, you realize that the rails don't just lead outward. They lead backward, too. Into memory, into stories, into the polite absurdities that once defined what it meant to be civilized. You've been a guest in that world tonight, and though you're glad to return, you can't help feeling a quiet fondness for its peculiar grace. Because despite all the starch and strangeness, the Victorians were trying to answer the same question you still ask when you travel, when you meet a stranger, when you sit in silence and wonder how to be good company in a fragile world. How should one behave when the future is moving this fast? And now, as the sound of the departing train fades into the distance, you let yourself breathe slower. The night has done its work. The rails have carried you not only across a century but through the rhythm of gentler things, soft laughter, quiet courage, small acts of grace performed in soot and steam. You picture the tracks stretching endlessly, glimmering faintly beneath the early sun. The world above them moves faster now, cars, planes, signals pulsing in silence. But somewhere, deep beneath all that noise, the old rhythm still beats. Click, click, click. The sound of order. The sound of longing. You let your thoughts settle like dust after a storm. The faces from the carriage drift through your mind. The cautious lady, the restless gentleman, the matron dreaming of rules she could finally stop enforcing. They fade softly, like candlelight retreating from dawn, leaving only the sense that you've witnessed something tender and strange. There's a sweetness to endings like this, the kind that doesn't demand meaning, only stillness. You stand there, breathing in the memory of coal and perfume, of handkerchiefs and whispered apologies, of people trying, in their own awkward, well-mannered ways, to be kind. So, as your eyelids grow heavy, imagine that same train rolling into the horizon, steam trailing behind like a silver thread stitching night to day. The journey continues, quietly, somewhere far beyond the edge of waking thought. And you, dear traveler, have reached your stop. Sleep now. Let the whistle fade. The rails are still warm, and tomorrow will wait.